What's up, everyone? Vinny Musso from Musso Athletics here for day 27 of our 30 Days of Force. So you can see today a little bit more on the board. I know it looks a little complex, but I promise it's not. We'll go over everything that's on the board and it all makes sense by the end of today's video. So again, our last 10-day cycle of our 30 days focusing on force production and more specifically about power and power output and how to train for power. And we spent the first part of the last 10 days talking about strength, absolute strength, relative strength, and we're finishing out by talking about power. So before we get too in depth into anything, if you haven't seen any of the videos yet, if you're just hopping on board now, I suggest starting back at the beginning in our intro video. Again, it explains everything, kind of the philosophy that we have moving forward, and just kind of explaining, what the 30 days of force, is and what we focus on talking about. But for those that are caught up, again, today talking about power. So if we remember yesterday's video, we talked about the force velocity curve right here, kind of a smaller version of it. So essentially, the force velocity curve shows the relationship between force and velocity when it comes to what the human body can do. So basically, the higher amount of force that we produce, the slower we produce it at. So it takes us longer, to complete a movement when we're generating more force. And as the speed of a movement increases, the overall force that the body produces decreases. So that's just the way that the human body works. As force increases, the amount of force that the body produces increases, speed decreases, and as the amount of force that the body produces decreases, speed increases. And again, that's just the way that the human body was designed to make, or the way that the human body was designed to function. Sorry. But we talked about how that relates to strength. Again, building our absolute strength, so really working kind of those heavier lifts, slower speeds, slower velocities, while don't have a direct carryover to athletic movements. They give us a base to build off of to develop our athletic movements further than we would be able to if we did not develop our absolute strength. Okay, so again, just kind of refreshing on what we talked about yesterday. And if you remember in yesterday's video, I said I would have a chart to kind of go more into detail about that curve, because we talked about absolute strength at the top there, we talked about speed at the bottom, and then we talked about power kind of being the sweet spot in the middle between absolute strength and speed. So that's essentially that point, where the human body produces as much force as possible and as fast as possible. But we also talked about a couple other different parts on that curve, which is strength speed and speed strength, which we'll go over today in the chart. So if we look at the chart here, again, it looks kind of confusing, but I promise it's not. It's essentially kind of putting our force velocity curve into more of a chart form. Okay? It's a little bit easier to kind of see numbers wise. So if we see the first part here, if we look at the labels at the top, so we have percentage of our 1 rep maximum, velocity in meters per second, and then training type as it relates to where it would fall on the force velocity curve. So when looking at our 1 rep maximums, so 1 essentially means that that's 100% of your 1 rep max, or that is your 1 rep maximum. Okay, and then velocity in meters per second is generally how long it would take you to complete a movement with that amount of your 1 rep max for that movement. And again, our training type is where we fall on the curve. So, we were talking a lot about absolute strength, and if you remember when we were talking about the strength parameters, how we talked about strength training and strength movements really being at 85% of your 1 rep max and up. So we've essentially talked about this first part of the table here, from 0.85 or 85% of our 1 rep max over. Again, that is our absolute strength. And you can see, again, similar to our force velocity curve, if I start at 0 here, so essentially body weight movement, and work my way up towards my 1 rep max, you can see how the speed at which I produce that movement at decreases. So again, generally when we're working at a 1 rep max, we're moving it at about, if we're really exerting max force, max energy, we're usually moving that around 0.3 meters per second. So again, not very not very fast when it comes to sporting movement. But then again, as you can see, as we kind of decrease the force, so as our 1 rep max goes down, we're relating it over to our force velocity curve. That represents our force part of the curve. So as my force goes down, you can see that my velocity increases. Okay, so as we move down the chart here, my force is actually decreasing because I'm using less of my 1 rep max, but I'm able to move that faster. Okay, so again, absolute strength, we're talking about that top part of the curve. Okay, we could see here as we move down to about, so generally that sweet spot we were talking about on the force velocity curve, that power point, where again, the body's moving pretty much as heavy weight as fast as it possibly can. That's usually around 60% of your 1 rep max. So 60% of your 1 rep max moved at about 0.9 meters per second. That gives us our optimal, kind of our midpoint on that force velocity curve. So we've talked about that. And then down here, our speed portion of the curve, again, the very bottom, we're producing relatively little amounts of force, but producing it very quickly. That generally happens down at around 10% of your 1 rep max down to body weight. Okay, but again, if you remember yesterday, we talked about strength speed and speed strength, which we'll kind of go into a little bit more detail here. So strength speed and speed strength, although they sound similar, it's just the two words kind of flipped for each of them. They're actually separate concepts, and they sound kind of familiar, but they are different. So for our strength speed work, essentially what we're doing is we're taking a heavy load, kind of as heavy as we can, and moving it as fast as possible. So again, this is more, it's closer to the absolute strength portion of our curve in our chart here, because we're trying to move as heavy of a load as possible, as close to that 1 rep max as we can. So basically we're trying to get as close as we can to our 1 rep max and move that weight as fast as possible. And again, we talked about the importance of working in that range, because that, again, kind of moves our curve this way and just gives our body the capability to produce more force and produce more power. Okay, so that's our strength speed portion of the chart and of the curve. And we've talked about this before. Kind of a good way to think about this, I like to call it football strength. So football or rugby strength, you could think of. So again, think of a lineman in football or the lineman in rugby, when they're pushing on each other. So they're generating a lot of force because they're pushing, not only their own body weight and their equipment, but they're pushing against another person pushing back at them. So there's a high amount of force being produced there. And while they are moving it at a relatively slower velocity compared to as we get lower down the chart here, and we get more down the velocity part of the curve here, they're still generating it as fast as they can. You can't generate it slow, otherwise that lineman is just going to push you over, and you're going to, your quarterback's going to get sacked, if you're an offensive lineman. So that's kind of a good way to think of strength speed, is football strength. So we have the lineman example, and then we use, the running back example. So imagine a running back, trying to break through a tackle. So he's got someone on defense wrapped around him, so he has to generate a lot of force, because again, he's trying to overcome the force that the defenders is pulling back and trying to pull him to the ground. So he's generating a lot of force, but not generating it as as quickly as if he were lower down here on the 1 rep max chart, or if we were lower down here on the force axis of our force velocity curve. So that's the way that we can view strength speed. So it's a heavy load, but moving that heavy load as fast as we possibly can. Speed strength is emphasis on the speed. So we're moving as fast as possible with as heavy a load as possible. So it sounds similar, but they are different. Strength speed is really all about the force, so it's really about the load and how close you're getting to your 1 rep max in terms of training. Speed strength is more down here, so the lower portion of the 1 rep max, but you're trying to essentially get your velocity up as high as you can while inching up here as well. So it's similar, but essentially the main difference is strength speed focuses on the strength part, or the force part, or the load part, and then the speed strength just really emphasizes the speed, just how quickly can you move something. And a good way to view this is, throwing and jumping strength. So think of throwing a baseball in baseball. Think of, kind of a shot putter, shot putting, or a discus thrower throwing a discus, or even just a basketball player jumping. So we're down since we're more closer to body weight when it comes to jumping. We're down further in terms of how much force we're producing. So not as much force, but we're generating it as fast as we can. Okay, so again, really emphasizing that speed portion of the speed strength training. And speed strength, as you can see here on the chart, it's, I like to refer to it as speed strength, but on this chart that I saw, it kind of breaks it into speed strength and explosive and then just speed, or kind of an easier way to view it, so we're not getting, too much into the details and the sub details. We can view speed strength, kind of as this whole block here. Okay, so kind of going back to strength speed, that's under our absolute strength. So while absolute strength is at about 85% of your 1 rep max and up, we're generally going to be training our strength speed in between 80% of our 1 rep max and 65% of our 1 rep max. So again, if we're working speed strength for a squat or a deadlift, we're taking whatever our 1 rep max is and we're working in that 80% to 65% or 65 to 80% of that 1 rep max. Again, even though it is a heavier load, we're still emphasizing moving it as quickly as we can to work strength and speed, with the emphasis being on strength. Okay, then after we get underneath that optimal power portion at about 60% of our 1 rep max, then our speed strength ranges from about 20% of our 1 rep max up to 55% of our 1 rep max. So again, lower in terms of force, lower in terms of the overall percentage of our 1 rep max. So since it's lower in terms of force, because it is lower down the spectrum in terms of our 1 rep max, we're really focusing on producing and moving that weight as fast as we can. So again, emphasizing the speed portion of our speed strength movements. And a good way to train this speed strength, kind of as we get further down the chart here and further down the curve here, is with ballistics. So ballistics essentially involve throwing an object. So this is where medicine balls, are really valuable to training, because if we look at it this way, when we're working strength speed, since we're moving heavy loads, if we produce that force as quickly as we can, since they are heavy loads, we're probably not going to be at the point where we feel like we can actually propel that weight. So an example, let's say we're working at 80% of our 1 rep max on a squat. Chances are, no matter how hard and how fast you try to go from the bottom to the top of that squat, you're not going to actually jump off the ground with 80% of a 1 rep max squat on your back. So you can really focus on moving that weight as quickly and explosively as you can, without having to worry about coming off the ground. Or if we're talking about bench press, you're probably not going to throw 80% of your 1 rep max for bench above your chest. All right, if you can, then your 1 rep max is probably higher than you actually think. As we move down though, and our weight gets lower in terms of our 1 rep max, then we kind of run the risk of not really moving it as fast as we possibly can. Because let's think about a bench press. Let's say we're working again with maybe like 20 to 25% of your 1 rep max for a bench press. Chances are, if you've been training for a while, and I'm sure there's a lot of people out there, if they took 20 to 25% of their 1 rep max for a bench, chances are, if they were really moving it as fast as they can, they would actually be able to throw that weight above their chest and actually let go of the bar. So one way that we can counteract that is to really kind of focus on moving the bar as fast as you can on that bench. Problem with that though is there's always going to be that deceleration. So while that first part of the movement, so if we're talking about the movement being from my chest to a full lockout at the top, that first half of the movement I can probably generate at maximum velocity, and I can push that bar as fast as I possibly can. Problem is, when I'm working again at that lower percentage of my 1 rep max, after I get past that halfway point, if I'm not throwing the bar, I have to slow down. So I've gone from producing as much force as fast as I possibly can, from 0 to 50% of that range of motion. But the last 50% of that range of motion, instead of really continuing to focus on moving as fast as I can, my brain is now switched to deceleration. Because again, I have to decelerate it or I actually throw the bar. So if we're just doing speed bench where we're not letting go of the bar, that first half is an effective rep because we're going as fast as we can, but that second half really isn't, working ideally anywhere in this chart around the curve because your body's actually decelerating. And think about alignment. So when you get up, you're in that 3-point stance, ball is hiked. When you come up to push your defender, do you get to here and then kind of slow yourself and decelerate to go meet your defender? The answer to that is simple, especially for those of you that play football. You don't decelerate. You don't go from here fast and then decelerate to go meet your opponent. You try to accelerate and push as fast as you can to meet your opponent, before he can, and that's what drives him back. So that is, kind of the risk we run if we're trying to work in this part, our speed strength, just using kind of our conventional weightlifting exercises like a deadlift, a squat, a bench press, and things like that. Because again, as we move down into these lower percentages of your 1 rep max, if you are not actually throwing that bar or coming off the ground with that bar, you're not truly working as fast as you can. Okay, so then we're not really anywhere on the chart because we're working at a low weight, but in reality we're not at these velocities here. We're actually slower because once we get to that halfway point, your body's actually decelerating. So we're not really teaching the body how to effectively produce force through a whole range of motion. So that's why ballistics are so important. Again, medicine ball throws, jump squats with the medicine ball, where you're actually jumping and throwing the medicine ball up. Because again, if you can get some pretty heavy medicine balls out there, so you can actually get a medicine ball that kind of simulates these percentages of your 1 rep max. But instead of worrying about actually throwing a barbell when you're bench pressing or jumping with a barbell on your back squatting, you can instead do medicine ball chest throws to work on that same motion that you get with a bench, or jump squat throws with a medicine ball to focus on that squatting motion. So again, we can get around these percentages of our 1 rep max, but still continue to focus on working at as high a velocity as we can, and that is why ballistics are so important. Okay. And one last thing we'll touch on for this video is if we look at the kind of the order of this chart here, this is actually kind of a good way also to view, we talked about periodization before, kind of building up, as we go through a program. So as we approach the end of a training program, we always have a training goal in mind, or kind of like an end result we want from a training program. And obviously, if we're training athletes, that is, we want the last part of our training program to essentially mimic what we're doing on the field. We want that last phase of training we want the carryover from the weight room or the training room to really come out onto the field. So what I mean by that is, let's say, on December, just to use an easy date, December 1st is when someone's basketball season starts. So, in basketball season, that's when we want to be moving as explosively as we can. So we want to be, jumping as high as we can, sprinting as fast as we can. And if we are just coming into, if we've been through a training phase but we were behind and we're just coming into, an absolute strength or a strength speed portion of our force production phase, as basketball season starts, then we really haven't put the athlete in the best position to succeed. Because ideally, again, we want to simulate what we're going to see on the court, in the weight room. And on the court, as a basketball player, or really any athlete, you're going to be moving, your body weight, essentially more than any type of added weight. And again, with the exception of, football or rugby, which is a little bit different story. But if we look at basketball players, soccer players, volleyball players, we're essentially working at 0% of a 1 rep max, because we don't have additional weight. We're just moving our body. So if we're looking at our our training phase, or our overall training program, we would want to be down here in the speed portion of of our training program. So again, our absolute strength, if after we built a base of, you know, our force absorption, we've built that base, take a deload week, and then we work on our force redirection. Again, build up a nice base there for redirecting force. Then we can, you know, move into, you know, absolute strength, down into strength, speed strength, and then eventually getting to really that game specific movements where we're really just on the speed portion of our training. Because again, if we've done it right, you know, if we've worked our absolute strength and our strength speed, where my curve was originally here, you know, I can essentially, you know, at this velocity produce, you know, this amount of force. If I've built my base with my absolute strength, I move this whole curve up a little bit. So instead of only being able to produce this much force, you know, like this part right here on our force velocity curve, if I move that up, then at the same velocity, I can now, you know, maybe produce that much force. And hopefully you can see that on the video. I just kind of made 2 marks on the scale there. So that's the importance of building absolute strength, and starting with absolute strength and then progressing down to speed. So even though we are, you know, kind of away from the heavy weights as competition comes, you know, we're still producing more force than we would if we didn't work weights. But again, the point of that last segment there is, you know, we want to start with absolute strength, but eventually progress as we kind of lighten the loads to, again, simulate more of the forces that we're going to see and feel, you know, on the court or on the field or whatever, on the ice, whatever it is, whatever sport that you play. You know, it's a good kind of a good template for progressing through a force production phase of training. Okay. So that'll do it for today's episode. Again, hopefully that all made sense. You know, we went through the chart. If you want to go ahead and pause to kind of see the numbers, I'll find this chart and probably put it in the description section of the video where I pulled this chart through. Again, just a good representation of, you know, the force velocity curve, and showing again that as we, you know, kind of decrease our 1 rep max, you know, the velocity with which we move it increases. And again, we want to, as an athlete, hit that point where we're producing as high amount of force as we can and as fast as we can. And kind of, you know, viewing it this way kind of shows, you know, what happens, you know, as we move up in weight or move the weight down, but also shows us the importance of building, you know, a base of strength before moving on to, you know, more explosive and lighter weight movements. Right. So make sure to give this video a like, subscribe to the channel too, share the video to anyone you think would be interested, and if you haven't had a chance yet, go on over to Instagram and take a look at Musso Athletics for more great training content. Thanks a lot. See you tomorrow.